Okay, welcome everybody to our last regular lecture of Introduction to Data Science. And today we have the special pleasure of hearing a lecture from Devin Lang. Devin is a PhD student in my lab in computer science. And as some of you might know, the PhD students in the School of Computing have like a teaching requirement. And as part of that teaching requirement, Devin also gets to teach the occasional class. And so he'll be talking today about network analysis. So Devin, please take it away.
Great, thanks for the introduction. Let me just pull up these slides here. And great, and I think I need to switch these. Are you viewing the right presentation here?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about networks here, and to get it out of the way, networks and graphs are sometimes used interchangeably here. So here we're looking at applications of graphs, and these are used all over the place in the world. They're used for ranking results in web pages at Google, your navigators, social media, and lots of applications. So yeah, here's a sort of a way to represent the Facebook friend requests across the Earth. In biology, there's many different applications. You can look at how genes interact, as well as proteins and different chemical products. If you consider the brain, you can look at how your neural networks, your neurons in your brain are connecting, and the sort of the graph structure of that. You can also look at your family tree, your history. The Utah has this Utah population database that tracks everyone's family history for since the state's beginning, basically. And you can also kind of take that to the extreme in biology and look at sort of the tree of life or evolution of different species. Yeah, another sort of extreme example is this very complicated chemical and biological process that I could not explain to you, but it's all represented as this sort of large graph of interactions. Another use case where people have sort of looked at properties of networks is tracking, among social networks, how certain behaviors or attributes within that network may, correspond to each other. So for instance, you can look at individuals who exercise a lot, and you can compare them to their small network, their friends. And basically they observe that you do see sort of this relationship. So if your friends are out, working out often, that increases the chances in some sense that you are also going to be working out. When we talk about graph theory, there's some sort of definitional things that we are going to want to cover, specifically like the difference between trees, networks or graphs, hypergraphs, and bipartite graphs. And one of the earlier, hello. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the earlier instances of using these sort of networks or graphs in math is this famous bridge problem. So I guess it was Euler who was looking at this, and there were these 7 bridges, with these different land masses, and Euler kind of pondered, is it possible to go on a walk, where you start on one landmass, you cross every single one of these 7 bridges, and get back to your starting point without being forced to cross one bridge more than once? That's kind of an interesting puzzle to think about. And it turns out you don't always have this opportunity, and the thing that kind of determines this in your graph structure is, at most you can only have 2 nodes in your graph that have an odd number of links. Yeah, cool. So especially in mathematical notation, you'll often see a graph denoted as this G with V and E, and the G is your graph overall, and it's composed of your vertices, V. These are also sometimes called nodes, and your edges, E. These are sometimes called links. And yeah, as I said, because I can't help myself, I might call these graphs or networks for this lecture. And yeah, on the right, you get this sort of basic representation where the circles are the nodes or vertices, and the edges are the lines connecting them. A simple graph, is one that has no multi-edges and no loops. So actually, this would be a simple graph, and this one would not. And this one breaks multiple rules, one being these nodes that have loops to themselves. So a node, can technically have a link or an edge to itself in some instances. And there are also two pairs here that have multiple edges here. So this is also possible in general, but you're no longer a simple graph if you do these things. You can also have directed graphs. So this is, a characteristic of the edges of the graph when you only can go in one direction. So similarly, an undirected graph would just draw an edge, and it's just assumed that you can go in either direction. And a directed graph, you have to explicitly say you can go from A to B versus B to A, or you can still explicitly say that you can go in both directions. A hypergraph, kind of generalizes these edges as, boundary regions. So these 4 points in the top left all have one quote unquote edge connecting them. And in some sense, these are kind of like just overlapping sets of nodes. But you can still apply some concepts from graphs here in your analysis. A couple of other important terms here would be the independent set. So not so interesting, a graph that has absolutely no edges, just a set of lonely points floating around. But one that comes up quite a bit more often in analysis are something called cliques. And this is the opposite of the independent set. Here, every single node is connected to every single other node within that clique. So of all possible edges that could exist amongst this set of nodes, they're all filled in. A unconnected graph is, kind of a less extreme version of this independent set. You can still have edges and you can still have components that are connected, but you cannot reach, all of the nodes are not reachable from all of the other nodes. So yeah. And an articulation point is a node within a graph that if you were to remove it, the remaining nodes would become unconnected. So in this example, if you remove this red point, these bottom 2 points are now unconnected from the rest of your graph. We also have something called a biconnected graph, which is a graph which has no articulation points. And this is, especially of interest in scenarios where, redundancy in your network may be interesting. So you could consider a network of like routers sending information, over the internet. Ideally, if one of those routers were to go down, you would be able to reroute that information elsewhere. So it's not a complete failure in some way. And a graph that is biconnected could have a failure at any single point, and it would still be stable, so to speak.
Devin, earlier you mentioned a simple graph that doesn't have loops, but it looked like that graph did have loops.
Yeah, so by loops here, I mean references to yourself.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. That's a confusion that I have sometimes here with this definition. But these intuitively loops where you have a path that consists of multiple nodes, this is okay.
Okay.
Yeah, are there any other questions actually at the moment? Okay, cool. Let's see. Yeah, so bipartite graphs, intuitively, this is a graph that you can separate into two sets here. And when you draw the edges or lines that connect them, that line will never go within your own set. It will only go to the other set. So in these two examples, the first one, circles only ever have a line connected to a square, and similarly, squares only have lines that connect to circles. You never have a circle-circle relationship or a square-square relationship. And then the graph on the right is kind of another illustration where these are separated. And a classic example that academics always come up with for a bipartite graph are paper-author relationships. So a author would be connected to a paper, right? And similarly, a paper would be connected to an author. And you can have this network that is kind of interesting. You can have a co-author but on a paper, but it requires hopping to the paper and back to the author. So this would be like one example of a bipartite graph. Yeah, so a tree is a special kind of graph. And it's sort of similar idea. You have nodes and edges, but with a tree, you have a root node and you have no cycles. So cycles are, actually what we were talking about earlier, a loop, quote unquote, that contains multiple nodes. So you have a root and then it kind of just descends downwards and there's no way to sort of loop around here. And you can also sort of think of trees recursively where you have your root node and then a list of children, and each child is itself a tree data structure. There's a special type of tree which keeps track of the order. For unordered trees, these two diagrams would be equivalent, right? The sort of general topology is the same, but with an ordered tree, the ordering of your children are important. Yeah, and in this case, you often end up using like parent-child sort of terms to describe the relationships in these trees. For paths, we kind of touched on this briefly with the cycles within a graph, but a path is just a route from one node to another node where you cross a number of edges to reach it. So in diagram A here, this orange path, from 6 to 4, 4 to 7, 7 to 5, 5 to 2, 2 to 1 would be an example of a path. And often here we're specifically interested in the shortest path. And yeah, and it's important to note that sometimes there are multiple equivalent shortest paths. So here, the shortest path from 1 to 7, there's actually two options which have the equivalent distance. And you also may, generally be interested in some of these properties for graphs. And one way you can look at this is the diameter of the graph. So just like the diameter of a circle is the widest distance line from one end of the circle to the other circle, the diameter of the graph is the longest, shortest path of that graph. So the longest, equivalent of a straight line in your graph space. Cool. So a degree is an attribute of a specific node within your network. And that is just the number of edges connecting that node. So in this example for A, node 4 has 2 edges, so it would have degree 2. Whereas node 2 has 3 green lines coming from it, so it has degree 3. And you can use this to sort of get high-level attributes of your graph. You can plot a histogram. Even with these simple examples, you get slightly different relationships. You can also compute the average degree. So you can kind of conveniently calculate this by just counting the total number of edges and then dividing by the number of nodes. And that gives you kind of a rough aggregate of like how connected is this graph, so to speak. And yeah, so here are these sort of similar distributions in a real network. And you can see, yeah, most of the nodes have very few like edges connecting them, but there are these outliers of like highly connected people. I believe this is I guess this is protein interaction. So there are some proteins that interact with many other proteins, but most would only interact with, you know, a couple. Yeah, and in some sense, this measure of degree is a measure of local importance. This network is from the play Les Mis, where each node here is a character, and you can look at all of the scenes within the story, and every time two characters co-occur, you know, they're in the same scene together, you count that. So edges basically are some relationship in the story between characters. And unsurprisingly, Valjean, who is the main character of the story, has like a very high degree in this network. Another way that you can think about this sort of importantness of nodes is through a measure called betweenness centrality. And we'll go into like exactly how to compute this a little bit more in detail later, but sort of intuitively, it's how central is this node in the overall network? How in between all these other nodes am I? And you can see some differences between these two. So if you look at this sort of cluster on the bottom, all of these nodes have relatively high degree. They have a lot of edges connecting them, but that cluster as a whole is sort of on the edge of the structure. So their betweenness centrality is quite a bit lower, whereas Valjean is, you know, the largest, obviously, in both of these measures. Yeah, and just like we can compute the histogram of the degree, you can do the same type of game with the betweenness centrality. Cool. I'm going to actually switch to some live code here in just a second. Okay. Are there any questions while I'm shifting over here? Cool. All right, so for most of this notebook, we are going to be using a library called NetworkX. And in the same way, there's these different types of graph data structures. NetworkX has different, you know, implementations for these data structures. So there's your regular graph, which is undirected. You have a directed graph, which as the name implies.
David, could you zoom in a little bit?
Yep. How's that? Great, so we have a directed graph, which as the name implies is a directed graph. And then you have multi versions of those. So these allow multiple edges between nodes, whereas the basic ones only support one edge between these nodes. So if we look at sort of the basic usage here, we're going to create a NetworkX graph called authors. We're going to add some nodes for authors, and we're going to add edges if they, I believe, have a co-authored a paper together. And you know, obviously, you can get those nodes back as a list, as well as the edges, which come in these pairs of strings. And we can, just continue adding nodes and edges. You can also pull out some or I guess here in this case, we are adding additional attributes to these nodes. So not only are the relationships stored, but for each person, we can store additional information. In this case, the institution of that author. For the first two, it's a single school, so it's stored as a string. But you can see here for Mark, we actually have a list of two different institutions. So you can store these multiple different data types as attributes here. And just like before, we can also pull this data back out and use it for all of them or for an individual node. And then if we want to start querying the topology of this network, we can also pass in a node name, and that will give us the immediate neighbors. So Mark has an edge connecting to Alex, Wolfgang, and Helwig. With graphs, it's often a good idea to do some visualization of it. It's a lot easier to see these smaller graphs. And NetworkX isn't necessarily the best visualization tool. There's more sophisticated ones like D3 if you want to write JavaScript code, as well as Cytoscape and Gephi. But it is relatively easy to use here. So yeah. And in this case, we are going to use a layout called a spring force layout, which we'll go into how that is computed a little bit later. But this will lay out your graph for you. You see the nodes as blue circles and the edges as lines between them. And if we want to sort of extend this, we can get the layout positions explicitly here as the positions, and then use those to draw the nodes, and also use those to add labels to the nodes. So here we get the same structure, but now for each of the nodes, we can see the labels for them. And there are other layout algorithms that you can use here. In this case, we're going to do the same thing, but with the shell layout algorithm, which is going to lay out your nodes in a circle instead of with this force spring layout. Cool. Any questions so far? Great. So we can get some of these basic stats that we talked about before, the number of nodes, the number of edges, and this average degree. So on average in the small list, you have 2.4 edges connecting you to other authors. And you can also sort of get that degree explicitly for each individual author. So we see that here. And yeah, and for the coming up, we're going to be plotting these with this draw network function, which we're going to use here. And the advantage of this is that we are going to pass in sort of weights so we can scale those nodes. So similar to what we were seeing in the slides, here we can scale the circle based on the degree. And we pass that in to the node size here as weights. And also like we saw in the slides, we can get a histogram here relatively easily for the distribution of degree within all our nodes. Cool. So this is sort of like a trivial example that we've built automatically, but if you are working with more complicated ones, you're probably going to want to save them off into a data structure. And in general, most people either use JSON or something called GraphML. And for this notebook, we're going to be using GML or GraphML. mostly because it's easier to load in because it's specifically for these graph data structures, where JSON is a little more generic. You can use it for modeling graphs, but you have to do a little bit of extra work so that NetworkX knows what is sort of referencing what. So if you open up one of these files, you can see there's sort of this hierarchical structure where you have your overall graph and then your individual nodes. Your nodes have a unique ID. You can include a label to describe it. And then your edges are the things that are going to connect your node. So in this case, we have a directed edge with a source and a target. And you can also encode attributes along that edge. So in our case here, the value are the number of times there were a correspondence. So yeah, Muriel and Napoleon were only seen together once versus Muriel and Baptistine were together 8 times. And the actual code, as I mentioned, for loading it is easy with NetworkX. If we look, we get, all of our characters in this story. Similarly, we can see there are 77 of those characters and 250 edges with an average degree of 6.5, roughly. But plotting it here, let me zoom out just a little bit. You can see a little bit more structure here. You see Valjean in the middle, and these different sort of clusters of characters. Cool. So if we look at connectedness, this is similar to what we were doing before. We're going to use this helper function to help us plot this network. And now we are scaling the nodes here based on the degree, similar to how we were before. So Valjean has the largest degree of all of our people. But using degree as a measure of importance isn't the only way to do this. As we talked about before, there's this idea of betweenness centrality. And sort of intuitively, what this is going to do is going to look at all of the possible shortest paths between pairs and check, does that short path go through this node? So let me actually switch to my iPad here, and we can go through a specific example together. If I can, all right, there we go. And I can share this. Great. And you should be seeing between a centrality and a little diagram here. And we are going to be looking, specifically at calculating the centrality of betweenness for this node E, which is why it's highlighted red. And the equation here that we're looking at is going to be looping over all of the node pairs within our set of vertices, and with a few exceptions. First, we are going to ignore pairs that are just a node to itself. So the pair BB is going to be ignored. It's not a particularly interesting path because it will never include E. And we are also ignoring paths that include E as a start or endpoint. So the path from E to B, for instance, will always include E. Therefore, we're going to exclude it from this measure. Other than that, we are going to be summing up these fractions. On the numerator, we are going to count for this pair, the number that include E, so the node V, which in our case is E, and then we're going to look at the total. So if we just go through all of these paths here, we start with AB. This is the shortest path from A to B. There are one of them, and it does not include E. So the numerator in this equation is 0, and denominator is 1. From A to C, sort of similar thing. No path there. A to D, again, does not include E. Nope. And now once we get to A to F, it gets a little bit more interesting because you may notice the shortest path from A to F could be this, but it could equivalently be along this route. So there are actually two options here that have the same distance. So, you saw here, this one does cross through E. So that is 1 for our numerator, and there are 2 total. So we get a 2 here. And if we repeat this process sort of like mechanically, B to C doesn't include it, B to D doesn't include it. So let me mark those 2 down. And then if we look at B to F, we get the same situation. There are 2 shortest paths from B to F. 1 includes E and 1 does not. So we are going to give that 1 out of 2. C to D also is an O for 1. And then C to F, again, is this, this one little diamond where we get 1 of 2. And then finally, D to F does not include E. So we're going to sum all of these up. Obviously, these are the only values that are 0. So the sum of all of these are going to be 1.5, which is your between a centrality value. In practice, this is often normalized by the total number of edges here, so that this value is easy to interpret regardless of the path size. So here there are 10 pairs, so we're going to divide that by 10, which gives us 0.15. Any questions about this analysis? Cool. Let me go back to our code here. Yep. Great. So in our code here, I've constructed the same exact plot that we were just looking at. And between a centrality with network X, again, is, they give us a function to do exactly that. And we can print that for every single item. So let me actually just plot this here so we can look at it. And then we scale by this centrality again. So you can see, unsurprisingly, that C is the most central in this, and then A and F are extremely not central. And our computation of 0.15 for this node E does line up, which is good. Yeah, and here we just do the same thing with our Les Mis data set, where we get this very central Valjean and not so central but highly connected nodes over here. An important thing to note with this is that in general, this can be computationally expensive. The number of vertices cubed. Though if you have if your edge weights are always 1, or if you have a sparse graph, this can be done faster. But in general, with weighted graphs, this is going to be your runtime. Cool. The last sort of measure of importance we're going to look at is something called PageRank. So you maybe have heard of this with regards to Google and ranking web pages, because this is sort of where this came from. And the early efforts of like ranking web pages, I believe, were more related to just the degree of nodes incoming to a website. And actually, let me take a step back here, because I should be explicit in that we can consider the internet and all these web pages as a huge network, right? Each web page is a node, and each link on that web page you can consider as an edge to another web page or another node. So the internet, in some sense, is this large directed graph. And if you compute the degree of a node, so the number of edges incoming, that might give you some sense of an importance, but you could also just create dozens or hundreds of websites that link to it, and if no one ever goes to those, not so important. So the idea of PageRank is that it was trying to basically account for the importance of a website linking to another website. So it's a little circular in some ways, but we'll see how this sort of like evens out when we go through it. And the way that I like to think about this is, if you could sort of like run an experiment with millions or trillions of people, give them each a random website, so it's kind of evenly spread out through the internet, and everyone just clicks randomly, mindlessly. You can imagine some websites people sort of disperse, and some websites that are sort of important in this big network, they will kind of accumulate. And it turns out actually that where people end up actually kind of converges after a while. And this, the number of people here is what we are considering as this page rank. So yeah, I think it probably makes the most sense to actually just go through another example here.
I have a question.
Sure.
With that page rank, does that create kind of a feedback loop where popular websites are ranked higher, and so therefore they're more likely to be viewed and potentially more likely to be linked to, which means that they become even more popular?
Yeah, for sure. This, what we're looking at is kind of like the most basic idea of this PageRank algorithm.
Right.
In practice, Google has had this for a decade or two at this point. And they've made a lot of changes and enhancements to it. Okay. And you're exactly right. There's this sort of like, how do you tease out the influence of the search engine itself in terms of the popularity?
Yeah, and that actually could basically kind of limit as far as the internet, what people view, and basically the variability of information, I guess you would say, which is not necessarily a good thing. So I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? Cool. So what we have here is a simple network with 4 edges, and you should notice that these edges are directed. So A is going to point to D, C is going to point to D, B is going to point to C, and then importantly, B and D have 2 edges connected to them. So you get both directions here. And kind of like I alluded to before, we're going to initialize this with equal portions on all of them. So you just take your total 100% or 1, and you're going to divide it equally between these. You can initialize with different weights if you have some beforehand knowledge on what this distribution should be, but starting it out just equally is perfectly fine. And this is our sort of iteration 0 of this process. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with A here and look at all of the outgoing edges. So we see A has one outgoing edge, which points to D. So 100% of the people on web page A are going to click D, and that's the end of it. So we're going to get 0.25 here, and A is done. So if we move on to B, it's a similar situation, except you need to notice here that B has two outgoing edges. So B will point to C and D. So therefore, assuming everything's random, we're going to split up the current portion of 0.25 between these two. So some are going to go to C, and some of these are going to go to D. And they're going to get a half of 0.25, which is 0.125. Great, B is done. Same thing with C. Here we only have one edge, so this all goes to D again. And then lastly, D only has one outgoing edge also, which is up here to B. So these are all going to go up here to B. And after all this process, you just sum them up. Nothing is left in in A. These two require no addition. And then here, finally, we get 0.625. And this would be our iteration 1. And in this algorithm, you now just repeat the same exact process, but with these new weights. So A, we don't have to worry about. We're done. For B, we do the same thing. We split these up. Half of them go to C, 125, and half of them go to D, 0.125. Done. C is going to go to D with all of them. We're just going to do another 0.125. And then lastly, D is going to give all of theirs to B. So B ends up with 0.625. And these are 0.25. And these are our scores after iteration 2. And you kind of just repeat this process until these weights have converged, so to speak. So if I stop my share and go back to our code, yep, we can see this in action. So again, here I've set up the same network, and I've actually implemented this, very basic implementation of this PageRank algorithm. So we start with all of the weights at 0.25. We draw the graph, print the weights, and then we do this process of, getting the neighbors, seeing what's currently in that weight, and adding that up to our new weights divided by, how many outgoing links there are, and we print it again. So if we run this, we should start out 0.25, and we should see our same 0.25, 125, 625. And then again, we see moving, sort of these to B. And if you continue this process, you can kind of see there's like a little fluctuation, a little bit of back and forth between B and D, but the changes get smaller and smaller. And eventually it kind of evens out here. And it turns out we don't have to implement our own version of this because NetworkX gives us a much easier way to do that with PageRank. So if we run that, we can compare our results, which are not exactly the same here. These differences kind of depend on how you decide to converge. And I also believe they calculate this with other math as opposed to sort of simulating it how we did. But you can see the overall weights are roughly the same. Yeah. The other advantages of using NetworkX's implementation here is that, they sort of cover all of the bases here. For instance, if you have a scenario where a website has no outgoing edges, I make some sweet blog, someone links to it, but I don't link to anyone else. I don't want to share my page rank. Well, it turns out they thought of this. And in that scenario, you kind of pop the person out and just send them to all of the other edges with equal probability. So this is included there. The other aspect that you can kind of play with often with this algorithm is the damping factor. And this is referred to as alpha within NetworkX. And if we think back to our, horde of people clicking around the internet, the alpha factor is related to how likely they will stop on a website. Presumably, if you are looking for something, you might have a goal. Once you reach it, you will stop. And the probability of stopping is 1 minus alpha. Inversely, the probability of continuing is alpha, which is our damping factor. So if we run this here, we get similar results, but one thing that's kind of nice is instead of getting absolutely 0 for this node A, we do get a little bit of value there. In this case, it turns out to be 15% times 25%. And we can play around with this also. If we make this damping factor really low, it's very close to our initial distribution, right? Most people, you start equally and then they just stop there. But yeah, there's no exact right answer, but the value of 0.85 is commonly used here. And yeah, we can do this for our Les Mis data set as well. This is not generally as interesting for directed graphs. It's not significantly different from just calculating the degree, which is easier to calculate, but we certainly can do it. And in NetworkX, they just treat directed graphs as, they treat undirected graphs as directed graphs with two directions always. Cool. Any questions about the PageRank algorithm? All right. So if we sort of plot these different histograms, you see, there's a similar pattern between all of them. Most nodes have a low value and some have high, but they're not exactly equivalent here, especially the centrality. There's even fewer outliers compared to the page rank and the degree. Another way that you can kind of think about the importance of a node is by removing it from the structure and seeing what the effect is. So in NetworkX, if you want to remove a node, you call the remove node function. And then you can look at the betweenness centrality of the remaining structure. And you can also, of course, plot it. In this case, we can see with Valjean removed, we no longer have a connected graph. We have these different sections of the graph. And you can quantify this by just counting the number of connected components. So graphs that are connected are a connected component. So we have the 1, 2, 3, 4. This whole chunk counts as one connected component, 5, 6, 7. So that's probably a game you could play also here, is removing a node and seeing the number of connected components also, in some sense, how much of a linchpin are you to the structure of this network? Yeah, so we're gonna look at some ways.
So let's do our break.
Sure. So the time is 1:15. We'll start again at 1:20. All right. Let's continue from our break here. Excuse me. So the next topic we're going to be going over here is our is path searching, right? And you can think of this generally as, how do I get from node A to B? And in some cases, this could be, literally you have a road network. You're in your GPS. Google Maps is finding you the best route from your house to the grocery store. But it can also be these abstract ideas as well. Routing information over networks, or I need to get a message to the president. Who in my social network can I hop to from one person to the next to get to that person? Yeah, and there's kind of two different ways to think about this path search. One of them happens where it's just the number of hops, the number of edges, and one is where edges have weights. And you can kind of think of the second as a generalization of the first kind, where the first kind is just a node where all edges have the weight of 1. And when it comes to these, you may have heard of something called depth first search and breadth first search. Breadth first search and depth first search, for the record, don't exist. But the closest thing might be when a computer science student tries to implement these first two for the first time. And then my fiance's favorite search algorithm is actually bread first search, which is just the shortest path to bread. Unfortunately, we are going to have to focus on breadth first search for this class, which is still a nice algorithm. And let me switch back to my iPad here. Great. So here we have a network, and we're going to be looking at finding the shortest path from the starting node B to our ending node G. And the first thing we do is we look at all of the neighbors of B. So that includes A, H, and C, all these immediate neighbors. And we're going to say the distance from B so far is 1 for each of these. And if you want to reconstruct the shortest path, you also need to keep track of where this came from. So these are all coming directly from the node B. And to keep things sort of consistent, we'll also do this on our starting node. Distance from B to B is 0, and we can use a special marker like a null pointer or something to indicate that this is the end. This doesn't come from anywhere else. So that's step 1. Next, we are going to keep track of all of these nodes that we just looked at in a queue. So I'll just write this down at the bottom here. We have A, H, and C. So we're done with B now. Next thing we do is we pop off the first element in this queue. So that's going to be A. When we look at A, we look at all the neighbors of A. And the neighbors of A include B. Turns out B already has this sort of bookmarking written down for it. So we actually ignore it. We do nothing. And there are no other neighbors. So we're done with A. And it's the same exact situation with B. The same situation with H. The only neighbor of H is B. So we're done there also. When we get to C though, we still ignore B, we don't care about it, but we do have these 2 additional nodes to explore, D and E. And we're going to take our distance so far of 1 and then increment 1 for each of these new edges and do the same sort of bookkeeping. We're now at distance 2, and this node is coming from C. Same thing here, we're at 2, also comes from C. And then we're going to add both of these nodes to our queue. And now finally done with C, we can cross it off. And continue the process, right? We're move on to D, our next element in our queue. And the only unexplored node so far is actually our goal node. So here, same process, take our current distance so far, add 1, which is 3, keep track of the node that we've come from. And there are some of these other explored nodes, but actually in this case, if we just want one of the best paths, we can stop at this point. If you want to find every single shortest path, you might need to keep going a little bit further. But at this point, we have our shortest path, and it has distance 3. And if we want to reconstruct the path, we start at our end goal. We see that it points back to D. We go here. We see that this points back to C. And finally, we get back to our beginning. And just reversing that list also gives you the path from start to finish. Is there any question with this general idea or algorithm? Cool. So turns out this works on this first type of graph, right? Actually, sure. Okay. Yeah, and let's see. We can actually call shortest path here in network X, and this implements this sort of procedure for us. So if we want to find the shortest path in our Les Mis data set between these two characters, it will give you, these 3, same thing with, these 2 characters. But as I mentioned, this works for this first type of graph where nodes don't have weights. And oftentimes you
Devin,
want to
is
have
that path in the network where you took out Valjean?
No, I believe we made a copy there.
Okay.
Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't be getting Valjean as part of the shortest path. Yeah, so to do this same operation, you can make some adjustments and it will work for a weighted graph. And that algorithm is actually called Dijkstra's algorithm. So let me go back and work through this together here. Here's a nice breadth first search. Yep. And Dijkstra's algorithm. And you see a similar thing. We are going to find the shortest path here from our starting node A to our ending node F. But the difference here, you see these edges just have lines, they have no weight. In this case, our edges have these weights, which are written down here, 7, 9, 14, etc. So yeah, like I said, the process is similar. We're going to start with A and look at the neighbors of A, B, C, and D. And the difference here is instead of this bookkeeping of 1 each time, we're going to actually look at that distance. So from A to B, the distance there is 14, and this is going to come from A. And we're going to do the same thing from A to C, which is going to give us 9, comma A. And this is going to give us 7, comma A. And we are going to keep track of all of these. It's a little bit different here because you, technically speaking, you don't keep them in a queue. The order is a little bit more important here. So the order that you are going to be storing these in correspond to the distance so far. So I'm going to write down the node and the distance so far. So we have D7, we have C9, and we have B14. And the other sort of bookkeeping thing that we have to do here is we have examined A, we've looked at the neighbors, checked them, and added them to this data structure. Therefore, we are done with A. And then just like before, we're going to look at our next item in our list, which is D7. We're going to perform that same operation, look at the neighbors. A is crossed out, we ignore it. C has this bookkeeping here, but it is not crossed out. So we do need to actually check this. And the check that we do is we look at the distance so far to D, which is 7. We add the distance from D to C, which is 7. 10. And if you were to take this path, then it would be distance 17. Now, this is larger in this case than the best case 9. So we actually do nothing here. We don't update anything that, we just consider this checked for this scenario and move on. The next neighbor of D is this node E. And here again, we do this same operation, distance so far 7 plus 15 is 21. And this is going to come from D. And we are going to add E to our Q. And it's E21, which happens to have a highest value. So our order is easy here.
It's
And-
22, Devin.
Yes, exactly. Good call. Great, thank you. Yep, and then we've done this process with D, so we can exit out. And let's exit out here. Great, now we can move on to C. We ignore this neighbor of C because it's crossed out, this neighbor of C that's crossed out. So we have these two to check. So let's look at the relationship from C to B first. If we look at this, we see the distance so far is 9. If we add 2, it becomes 11. And this value of 11 is less than 14. So we actually go and update the values here. So now this is just the best distance to this node is 11. And now this would be coming from node C. And we should also update that down here and just a little bookkeeping check. And we do the same thing here. So we check 9, which is 9 so far, plus 10, it's 19. Can erase my almost mistake anyway. Great. So we can put 19 there, and this came from node C. Great. And we've done this process with C, so we're done. Cross it out. And last bookkeeping thing, need to make sure I do, is this. Again, we are just lucky here in that this order matches the order we're going, but if this changed to value 7, for instance, we would look at this node next, but it doesn't. So we're going to look at node B, which is up here. And we're getting close. These two we can ignore. So we have 1 to check. And this is going to be our current 11 plus 9, which is 20, which comes from B. So we can X this out, but the question I have here is, can we stop at this point in the algorithm? I see one head shake from someone with a PhD in computer science. So no, you have to be a little bit careful here at your stopping condition, because in this case this happens to be our best path. But let's just think about this for a second. This is saying the best path we've found so far has 20, but if we look at our unexplored nodes, E, we have a path to it with 19. So it could technically be the case that we find a better path. And yeah, let me take a step back here, and I forgot this step of adding U to our little queue here. So let's just go through the process a little bit more, see what E is. We do nothing with these again, but we can look here. The distance so far is 19. We add 6, and that would be 25. So it turns out this is not better. But as I said, if this edge weight had happened to be 1/2, we would have found a better route here. So in general, you kind of need to go until all of your sort of queued up nodes down in this section are equal to or greater than the best path so far. And this kind of amounts to coming to your goal node in this process. So yeah, at this point we are done. We can sort of backtrack through this. Best distance is 20. We have to go back to B, go back to C, goes down here, go back to A, and that brings us that. So this purple path is our shortest path, and the value is 20 here. Any questions about this? Cool. And before I go back to the slides, I'm just gonna jump ahead slightly here and say that this works, and this is like often used, but it's not actually the fastest way that you can get to this outcome in all scenarios. And this faster version, let me get this, is an algorithm called A*. And A*, you know, the mechanics of it is very similar again, but with a slight alteration. And this alteration amounts to including a heuristic in your search algorithm. So heuristic is like a shortcut where you don't know the answer for sure, but it has some good guess as to what it is. And what that amounts to is that you use this shortcut to this heuristic to say, order this list in our bottom. So instead of ordering it by the shortest path found so far, you ordered by the shortest path plus what you guess the distance to the goal is, right? So you're looking at your best case scenarios first, which helps you sort of focus to the goal quickly. And your exit condition can be a little bit sooner because you're, if you have some node, say, you know, over here, and the distance to it so far is still less than your candidate distance, but this distance plus your heuristic is greater, you don't need to explore that anymore. So let me just go back to our slides here, and you can see kind of like what this effect sort of looks like a little bit. Yeah, so in this GIF, we see the basic version. Let me share. Always gets me. We see the basic implementation of Dijkstra's and as sort of like a motion planning path. You start here in the bottom left.
You're sharing the wrong window.
Thank you. Let me grab this guy. First try. Okay. So in this GIF, the motion planning, there's sort of a motion planning task happening where you have like a car or a robot down on the bottom left, and it's trying to get to the top right. And it's just exploring evenly on a grid, and you have some wall or obstacle here. So you can see it kind of just expands radially outward, right? It's just, you know, going based on that list order. And then once it finally finds it, it still goes just a little bit further until we find this shortest path. And in A*, the search queue is directed much more to here. So you see it fills up to here first, right? It has no knowledge of a wall being there, but it still helps cut down on the amount of computation and nodes that you have to search and practice by quite a bit usually. Yeah, so of course we can get all these nice algorithms from NetworkX. We have Dijkstra's where we have this path of people here, and yeah, here we have no values on those edges, so this is kind of just counting the number of hops. And in this case, you know, somewhat counterintuitively at first glance, once you include the weights, we actually add an extra intermediate node here. So if we look at what is happening here, it's because this particular edge is quite large, and these two nodes with smaller values end up being smaller than it. So it's careful. It's good to be careful of like not getting too stuck in sort of like a Euclidean space here, where you can get these types of interactions. Yeah. So we already kind of talked through A star here. Yeah, and NetworkX does have an implementation of A star. The thing with A star that you need to have is this heuristic, and you need to be a little bit careful about the criteria for that heuristic. Basically, the predicted distance must be less than or equal to the actual distance to the edge in all cases, in order to guarantee that optimal path being returned by the A star algorithm. And in our case, for this Les Mis graph, we don't really have a meaningful heuristic to accomplish that. But for example, like if you have like a road network, a common heuristic would be like the distance as a crow flies. So you can't drive directly from my house to the Capitol, right? I have to stay on the road and not drive through buildings, but you can use this heuristic, which will always be less than or equal to the distance I'll actually have to travel on a road. Great. Moving on from some path detection, we can look at community detection, which is kind of finding like clusters or groups of connected nodes within a network. And it's important to note that this is sort of like clustering a scatter plot. There's no exact right answer here, but there's different things that you can do that give reasonable responses. And like all these things, NetworkX has a convenient function for getting these communities. In this case, it finds 3 different sort of communities within this network. This network is, I guess, a karate club where edges are if people interact. I guess it's used a lot in like the graph community because there's some division and the graphs eventually separated, so people are interested if you can like kind of analyze and detect that. So if we just plot this here, we can see roughly we have this orange community here, a purple in the middle, and then on the other end this blue group. And we can do the same thing with our Les Mis data set, of course, can kind of see similar things where you get these groups of people. And well, we have 2 minutes left. I have more slides on visualization, but it's a little slow, I guess. Oh, we can go.
Just refer
All right.
this class, and we can share the slides if people are super interested.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just say there's a lot more sophisticated ways for visualizing these types of networks beyond just these sort of node link diagrams that we showed with NetworkX. If you're interested, yeah, you should take a visualization class for sure. Great. Any questions for the last 30 seconds for me?
I was going to ask about the traveling salesman problem. Is that so much harder because you don't have a set starting and ending point? It could be any arbitrary starting and ending point.
Well, it's in addition, you have all of the intermediate points, right? So it's not a path from here to here.
Right.
It's a path from here, da 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 da.
Right.
And that aspect of it is really what sort of cranks up the computational complexity there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Devin, and everybody. Good luck with the final push on your projects.